You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Eric Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Eric.
Welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Johnson, and today it's a great privilege of mine to have someone new to the podcast. We want to introduce to our audience Pastor Dennis Harry. Pastor Harry is the pastor at Needham's Grove Baptist Church in Seagrove, North Carolina. He is the husband to Lori and the father of 4 children. He is the founder of Chosen Vessel Pottery. We'll talk about that a little later on. Also, he is the host of another podcast called the Better Together podcast with his wife, Lori. And he is a very intense Duke College basketball fan. Pastor, it's a great privilege to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Well, I had no idea that my love for Duke basketball was going to make it onto the podcast.
Well, if we follow you on social media, it's pretty evident. So it's part of who you are.
It is. It's part of who we are. You know, it's a small part, but it is interesting that when the Lord brought us to Central North Carolina 9 years ago, we were able to begin to establish kind of a physical connection to Duke basketball. We'd always loved Duke basketball, but we've been to one game at Cameron Indoor, which is very expensive to get tickets. Not easy.
Yes.
But we've been able to go to some fan days where you could go and get signature autographs and things like that. And we were able to go to the Greensboro Coliseum last year for the ACC tournament. That was so much fun. Yeah.
Well, you'll find over the years that most pastors are into sports, and I'm no different than that. And so those are fun pastimes to have. But today we actually want to get to know Pastor Harry very well. So we're going to start from the beginning. Pastor, why don't you let our audience know a little bit about yourself, maybe where you grew up, when you trusted in the Lord, and maybe a little bit about how when you met your wife.
So I'm going to start by saying, Eric, how much I appreciate the privilege of being on this podcast with you. You know, I've thought in my life, I've thought through, you know, what do I want to be known for as a person? And as a husband, you know, I definitely want to be known for my relationship with my wife and with my children. So I love my family. When it comes to being a pastor, you know, there's so much about being a pastor that you want to do well, but there's something that I hope when I step away from ministry, I hope that I am known as a pastor that had a heart for missions. And so it really is an honor, Eric, for me to be able to come on with you today. I was saved when I was 7 years old, grew up in a home where, you know, my parents got saved when I was a young child, and they grew up good, moral people. And I use that in air quotes. You know, my dad was in the Navy. They drank, they smoked, you know, that was just the normal life. But to them, you know, they were Christians, they were good. But my parents were confronted with the gospel, the parable of the prodigal son, the son having to acknowledge his sin and come home to the Father. And the Lord just wonderfully saved both of my parents when my dad had been in the Navy for 10 years. And at that point, God called my dad into ministry. So my dad stepped out of the Navy, moved to Atlanta, went to a small Bible school. And it was while we were in Atlanta that I was saved at the age of 7 there in our home. My dad led me to the Lord. And not soon after, we moved to Charleston. My dad thought he was going to be a pastor, but God actually called him to minister to the military. Dennis and Georgine Harry served faithfully there for many years. In fact, this year they officially stepped down and retired as full-time missionaries. So they have been at it for a long time. And so we worked with the Navy. The Navy guys that were there worked with the Air Force recruits and the Air Force men and ladies. And so I kind of grew up there in Charleston. My wife and I met when I was in high school. And we did date in high school, kind of liked each other. That's something we talk about a lot on our podcast. In fact, we just recorded yesterday or 2 days ago, we recorded an episode on walking your teen children through the dating age, you know, how to help them establish and grow good, healthy relationships. And we reflected a lot on our the times that we dated when we were in high school and then into college. My wife and I both went to Pensacola Christian College, and we both got our degrees in education. And I felt like I was going to be a teacher the rest of my life. Science and math, physics, chemistry. I loved the physical sciences. And after teaching for 8 years, the Lord directed my heart and opened the door for me to become the youth pastor at our church in Charleston. And so I stepped out by faith, and it really was by faith, because I did not feel adequate in any way, shape, or form. I did not feel prepared. And yet I just leaned on the Lord. I remember those early years in ministry, just feeling so inadequate for what God had called me to do. And so I just spent time studying, lots of time studying, training, preparing. And after 10 years of being the youth pastor there in Charleston, the Lord directed our steps to come to Central North Carolina. I'm the pastor at Needham's Grove Baptist Church. It is a rural church. I have to be careful. I so often say, I pastor a small rural church. We run about 200. It is not a small church.
No, it's not.
Yet the Lord has blessed us and blessed our people over the years. We've had healthy pastoral leadership for the last 50 or 60 years. So the Lord has just really blessed our congregation, and they have a heart for missions, which has been wonderful to just come right in perfect unison with their desire to support missions on such a broad level. I finished my Master's of Divinity from Piedmont back in 2020. And Lord willing, in 2 years, I will finish my doctorate of ministry from Pensacola Theological Seminary. And I am doing my doctoral dissertation on regarding the relationship of the local church and missions. So missions is definitely something that is a heartbeat of mine. And so I do, again, I say it is a privilege, Eric, for you to invite me to be on. I realize that this is a podcast that, hundreds or more missionaries are going to listen to, not just this week and next week, but over the course of the lifespan, maybe into the thousands. And my prayer is that God would use the influence of your podcast to really encourage those that have just given everything for the cause of Christ.
Well, wow, that's great. So we're your homework, is what you're saying. Being on this podcast is homework. I got it. Yeah, no, that's great, Pastor. What a great synopsis of how the Lord has led you now to the position you're at. And we had the privilege of meeting Pastor and his wife and three of his kids, and getting to know the church as well. And it is true. We have a number of churches that support us in rural settings, but they have a very dynamic church that is in a rural setting, but it's not only a large church. It has a great, different ages going to the church. You have old, you have young, you have families, and that is encouraging to a missionary, because a lot of times we go into churches and there's certain demographics only, and we can understand that maybe the life of the church may change in 10 years. And so it's exciting to see a vibrant church there in Seagrove. Now, transitioning a little bit, Pastor, I think it would be really interesting to the audience to tell us a little bit about that part of the country. My family, my wife and my kids, we came to visit you just a few months ago. And as we were going through that area, we noticed on the map about everywhere you could throw a rock, you would hit some place with the last name Pottery on it.
That's
this
right.
Family Pottery, this family Pottery. And so we started thinking, what in the world is going on? So tell us a little bit about Seagrove, North Carolina, and that area.
So, it's interesting. When the Lord directed our steps here to Seagrove, Needham's Grove Baptist Church had no Facebook page, no website, nothing. So we didn't know anything about the church. So we simply looked up and Googled Seagrove. We thought this church from Seagrove was going to be near Wilmington or Holden Beach or something on the coast. No, it's right in the middle of the city, right in the middle of the state. And we found out very quickly that Seagrove is the pottery capital of the U.S. And about over 100 years ago, a couple of families moved to this direction. There's a natural supply of good Carolina clay right here in this area. Wow. And so a number of families set up shop and began began throwing pots and selling them to people that traveled through. So Seagrove has been known for quite a while as a vibrant pottery community. Now, it did not translate to radical growth. Seagrove is still a very small town. We have one stoplight right in the middle of Seagrove. It's the crossroads. Robbins, the nearest town to us, has 2 stoplights, so it's getting up there. Okay, so we're talking small town America, but there are people everywhere, and there's just a wonderful pottery culture. My wife and I have always loved pottery. So when we moved here, I said, "Okay, Lord, if you would be willing, I would love to learn." And in 2020, when all of the COVID craziness hit, there was a sense of intense busyness, but then there were also times of quiet, and you kind of sit around. It's like I couldn't make hospital visits. I couldn't go visit. I couldn't do the normal things I was doing. Now, ministry was very intense, but there were moments where I could not do the normal things. And so a lady in our church graciously gifted me a pottery wheel and a kiln, and I began the process of learning. And so that was how Chosen Vessel Pottery was born. And so now I make custom coffee mugs for churches and schools. I've made them for Maranatha, there you go. That's one of them. Be still and know that I'm God. I've made them for Pensacola Christian College. I make them for schools and churches. And what I love is the fact that, okay, so let me back up one second. I'm also a little bit of a technology nerd, Eric. A little bit.
Yes, we know.
And so I thought to myself, if I'm going to throw coffee mugs, I want my coffee mugs to communicate my faith. So I got into 3D printing. And so now I 3D print the logos, all of my logo stamps I design and 3D print, which allows me to then create coffee mugs that communicate our faith. I like to take verses that are known from God's word or comforting. I will trust him through my trials and tribulations. Be still and know that I am God. All of these different things that we would want to communicate about our faith. And I'm able to put them onto pottery and really use them to communicate our faith through our caffeine. Amen.
Amen. Well, we're going to keep talking about this because this is really neat. The neat thing was we had communicated ahead of time before we actually met, but a few minutes before we met Pastor Harry and got to the church and his house, we actually had to stop and use a restroom, and we stopped at one of those pottery places. I think it was at the Crossroad, and inside this enormous, place of just all kinds of pottery, they had a lot of pastors' cups and I think soup bowls, things like that. And it wasn't just Bible verses, which were really good. I think there were some things about some pro-life messages. There were just different messages and we were talking to the lady, and she was telling us all about it, how those were like the ones that would be, often sought out by people. So it's a really neat ministry to be a part of. Now, I know Pastor's got the spiritual side, but he did tell us about, there was one name you were considering. I think it was Harry Pottery or something like that.
That's right.
I've often thought about that. I probably would have been less spiritual because that was a pretty funny.
There were a lot of people that told me that's what I should have chosen, was Harry Pottery. And I'm like, I just don't think I can do it.
No, that's pretty good. But Chosen Vessel is a great name, and we had the privilege of not only firsthand having Pastor tell us these stories, but he actually let us go into the inner sanctum, if you will, to go down to his basement. And he showed us how the sausage is cooked, if you will, and
that's right.
Everything, and showed us all the different processes. Actually, did a vase with us right there, and it was very late. We had a long travel day, but my son Tyler is the world's question asker.
Oh my goodness, he asked some great questions.
He is very observant. I was very thankful for Pastor taking the time to so kindly go through everything. But I will also encourage those. I believe, Pastor, you have a YouTube channel where you can go on. And Pastor recently, within the last 6 months or so, preached a message at a visiting church, a nearby church, where he goes through the whole process, a message about pottery in the Bible, different verses. And we just recently watched that as a family. It was very entertaining, but very inspirational as well. And I think those who are wanting to maybe visualize the process,
Sure.
it is amazing. And I think all of us have probably seen it, but until you're really up close, it's a very inspirational. Pastor, I was talking to your wife. This is not like the first hobby you've had something like this. Like you tend to lock in on something. She was going through a list
yes.
of pens and different things that you've done in the past. So what are some of the ones you've done in the past?
So, I'm just a natural, like I like learning. And I know that's the nerd side of me. Oh, hey, let me tell you something funny. So Bud Stedman on your podcast, on a recent interview, and that was one that I was listening to, was Bud Stedman, talked about when he was a child, he used to read encyclopedias. Do you remember when he said that?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I read encyclopedias as a child. When he told me that, my heart was so warmed. I'm like,
the World Book.
That's right. We had the red World Book encyclopedias, and that's what I would do at night. I'd go in my room and just enjoyed reading them. I was a bit of a nerd, so I enjoy learning. When my wife and I first got married, I played golf, but I learned that was something that was taking too much time away from the family. So I don't think I had any real hobbies the first 10 years, because our family was so young. When you have little kids, you just don't have any time really for anything outside of parenting.
Herding cats.
It's right. So then I bought a lathe, and I was making pens. And so that was something I did for a while. I made pens and still have a few that I made. I should, here's one I just happen to have in my drawer. So this is uses a cartridge for a 30-06 and using some maple and a beautiful pen. So I made pens. And then after that, I started keeping bees. And so I did that for a while, had about 8 hives, loved the honey that came out of the hives. Now that was one,
right.
My wife saw me, my wife came out to the garage one day, and she thought that we were building a giant birdhouse. I didn't correct her. Like I didn't tell her, no, it's not a birdhouse. And it was 3 days later when I went and picked up the bees that my wife was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, this is actually a beehive." So needless to say, we had bees, and actually brought those to North Carolina with us when we came.
Wow.
But I ended up with Lyme's disease 3 years after we came, and I had to step away from beekeeping because there were always ticks around, and I just needed to step away from that. I love doing remote control airplanes. I built drones.
Another one. I remember.
I built drones when we lived in Charleston, back before you could buy them. I was building them and flying remote control airplanes. But then when we moved here to Charleston, or moved here to Seagrove, I knew pottery was going to be ultimately where I was going to land, because that was something I had always wanted to do. And I tell you, the reason why I'm so thankful that the Lord brought us here, I made the decision when I started throwing pottery. I said, "Lord, let this be a way that I can communicate my faith and I can minister to people." I have probably given away as many coffee mugs as I've sold. And there are missionaries that I'll give them away to. There are Christian coffee shops. There's a Christian coffee shop in Atlanta, and I will often send them a box of 20 mugs, and whatever they sell goes to missions, medical missions outreach. You've had Brother Brad Edmondson on. I supply them with about every 6 months. I send them a box of MMO mugs or tribe mugs, and I don't charge them. I just send them, let it be a blessing. And so I do my best to let the skill that God has allowed me to develop just to be a way I can be a blessing to pastors and missionaries.
Well, that's very exciting. We enjoyed seeing it firsthand, and we will encourage you at the end of the podcast. Pastor will tell us where, if you're interested in something like that, where you can find it. We found some when we were at a family camp in the wild. So there's lots of places you can find it. And I believe you can even order online. Well, let's make a quick transition, Pastor. One of the ways when we first became acquainted with you was through your podcast that you have that is entitled Better Together, that you host with your wife, Lori. Pastor, why don't you give us a little brief how that started and how it's going now, because there's actually been a recent development where you've kind of divided it in 2 parts.
Yeah. So my podcasting journey actually started in 2019 or 2018 when we had moved out here to the country. I was lonely, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, my wife was working part-time in Asheboro. Our kids were always at school, and I needed to connect with pastors. So I started a podcast called Let's Talk Church, and I interviewed pastors and missionaries just like we're doing today. And I think I got to about 80 episodes. It was such a blessing. Oh, I loved it. And so I learned kind of the ins and outs of how to podcast, how to edit the audio, how to submit your audio files, how to develop a web page, all those different things. So about 2 years ago, my wife and I hit the 25-year mark in marriage.
Wow. Congratulations.
And when we hit that mark, there was something, I don't know, my wife and I had a lot of discussions about this. We felt like we had finally reached the point where our thoughts and wisdom and ideas on parenting finally had a little bit of weight to them. Meaning, you know, it's not that practical to have a parenting podcast, in my opinion, if your children are 1, 3, and 5. if you're giving advice on parenting, because honestly, so much of what we did when our kids were 1, 3, and 5, we look back and say, don't do that. We learned the hard way. And so at the point that we reached 25 years, I challenged my wife and I said, I would like for us to give back primarily to the people in our church, the families in our church. So we're going to record a podcast once a week. And then the families in our church, the couples in our church can listen to it, and it can be an encouragement to them. And, you know, initially we scripted out almost everything. My wife and I would sit for an hour and a half. We would brainstorm over a topic. We would type out every point that we were going to make, because everything had to be super scripted. Now, that wasn't for me. That was for my wife, because she had never talked behind a microphone. She was not comfortable with it. And plus, I preach. I'm in front of people 4 times a week. Like, it's normal for me. It was not normal for her. So we started recording back in the spring of 22. Spring of 22. And we recorded about 30 episodes. We made it to the summer. We had a wedding. And then last year, the school year was incredibly busy for our family, because we had 2 children that were in college at the same time. I had 2 full college bills. And the Lord allowed, and I praise the Lord for this, He allowed my pottery to just explode. I had so many orders coming in, but it allowed us to pay for the college bills. So praise the Lord for that. Like, I give God the glory for that.
Amen.
But it took up so much time. When we came to the end of the summer this last year, Lori and I sat down, and we realized that we needed to get back into it. So we called the first 30 episodes season 1. We're now about 10 or 12 episodes into season 2. And what I have found is my wife, oh man, she has become a natural behind the microphone. It's awesome.
Yes.
I don't know. You can probably hear the difference if you've listened to episodes. She now, you know, we sit down and talk, and she is imagining in her mind couples on the other side, and she's talking to them, and she's encouraging them. And she has just turned into an incredible partner in that podcast. So anyway, it's gone really well. It has grown. Even when we were not producing episodes for about a year, we had a consistent listenership. Every month, about 600 to 700 people were listening, listening to back episodes. And so now that we're producing episodes again, those numbers are just continuing to go up. And so anyway, the Lord is really blessed with that. And yes, we have split it off, and we now have a second podcast. And so that one is called, so our first podcast is called Better Together, and it is Christian parenting and Christian marriage. And the second podcast is called 5-Minute Marriage. And in that podcast, Lori and I just spend 5 minutes. It's a short form podcast we spend 5 minutes discussing one question. And so I will ask Lori a question, she answers it, and it always deals with marriage issues. And so anyway, that's sort of the second podcast that we have started that the Lord is really, really blessing.
Well, Pastor, that is great to hear. We love that podcast. My wife and I, one of the things we like to do, we each take an earbud and we walk in our neighborhood and we'll listen to your podcast. I normally, when I listen to a podcast series and I find something I like, I'm one of those guys that I go from podcast one to the newest. But this has been the difference because the topics are so unique that sometimes we'll choose ones that, maybe are a little closer to what we're dealing with right now. I'm the kind of guy, I like to get all the content. But with your podcast, which is wonderful, and I was talking to you about this earlier before we hit record, is that it's very difficult to find good marriage podcasts. I think one of the reasons I love your all's podcast so much, it's very practical. You guys go through things very meticulously. It's not kind of pie in the sky. It's giving your real life examples, but giving scriptural principles, but then also going through, maybe good things that you all saw through things, or maybe even errors you've made. And that's very real. It's just a great perspective. With that in mind, as far as some of the topics, we're not going to talk about all of them, but maybe talk about some of your favorite topics you've had to tackle, and maybe ones that were maybe more difficult to talk about.
Sure. So let me pull up real quick some of our podcast episodes. All right, there it is. Podcast recorded. All right. So probably so what we try to do as we record our podcast is we try to give a balance, like you said, between marriage and parenting. With marriage, you have issues that you face when you're newlyweds, but you also have marriage issues that you face when you've been married for 20 years or longer. When you're parenting, you have parenting issues with young kids, but you also have parenting issues with teenagers. So we do try to bounce back and forth. And so, yes, not every episode is going to be something that every family will be able to embrace. And so because of that, I understand we're not serving a specific small niche of listeners. We're not speaking to just newlyweds or to just new parents. But I believe the wisdom that we give sort of spans each of those generations that we face in our marriages and in parenting. I tell you what, I love talking about parenting because I love my children, and I love seeing what God has done through our family. I'll highlight the two things that I think the Lord has just reinforced in our family through this podcast. Number one is in the area of parenting. God has not called us as parents to raise up good children. God has called us to raise up good, godly, God-fearing adults. And we don't make that statement in relationship to the good. Like, obviously, we're not talking about we just want to be good moral people. But God hasn't called me to raise up children. The goal of parenting is to prepare your children to become adults. And I think so much of our parenting today in the world's eyes is focused on meeting the needs of kids in the here and now. And we forget that in 15 years, my 5-year-old will likely not be living at my house. We'll be off at college, having to make decisions on their own. So am I preparing my children to be the adults that God wants them to be? And then when our children get to that point, being willing to let go. And we are at that stage right now, Eric. Our children are our oldest is 25. She's married, is on staff at Pensacola. Our son, Andrew, is a senior. He's getting married in May, and he'll be going on staff at Pensacola. We have Emma, who's a sophomore at college. And then our youngest, Laurel, is a junior in high school. Our kids are stepping into adulthood. And so many of our friends say, oh man, I wish we could have just kept our kids young. I loved when our kids were little. I loved when our kids were young. And I think that misses the mark. Like we miss the point. God didn't give me children to enjoy them when they're young. God gave me children to train them up to serve him with their lives, which
Mhm.
means at the point that our kids walk out and they step out onto their own as adults, I get to sort of wash my hands and say, mission accomplished. I've done all that I can. Now go out and serve the Lord. That's the whole point of parenting. And so that's probably one of the biggest things we've focused on parenting. The second thing that we have really focused on that I think the Lord has really used, has grown us in our marriage relationship, is in the area of unconditional love and unconditional respect.
Mhm.
Years ago, my wife and I read the book Love and Respect by Dr. Emerson Eggerichs,
Mhm.
and it basically lays out the argument from the book of Ephesians that the greatest command, the greatest command for all of us is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind,
Mhm.
and strength. The second greatest command, or the second, which is like unto it, is love your neighbors
Mhm.
yourself. Well, our neighbor, there's no closest neighbor that we have in our life other than our spouse. Like
Right.
my wife, I spend more time with her. I serve her more. I help her more. I'm around her
Mhm.
more than anyone else. So if there's anyone in this life that's my neighbor, she, number one, is my neighbor. How can I love my neighbor well? How can I love my life biblically? And Paul lays that out for us in the book of Ephesians. And husbands are commanded to love their wives for two reasons. Number one, because that is a wife's greatest need, to feel loved.
Mhm.
But number two, because men don't naturally love the way a wife needs to be loved. That's why we have to be commanded.
Right.
Wives are commanded to honor and reverence their husband. I know the word submit is a kind of a trigger word that sometimes people
Mhm.
get caught up on in that passage. But I believe Paul sort of clarifies what the submission is at the end of the chapter when he
Mhm.
says, so for this cause, a husband should love his wife and wives should honor and respect their husbands. Honor and reverence. I'm sorry, that's the word
Right.
that's used there in the King James. Honor and
Mhm.
reverence. And so wives are commanded to reverence their husbands. Why? Well, for two reasons. Number one, that's the greatest need of a husband, is to feel respected. But number
Mhm.
two, that's not the natural language that a wife speaks. And so she has to be commanded to do that. Wives speak the language of love, husbands speak the language of respect. And so that's why we each have to learn how to best serve our spouse. That was life changing for Lori and
Mhm.
I. We did not learn that until probably the 10th year, 12th year of our marriage.
Mhm.
And when we learned that, it radically changed the direction of our parenting. I can say without a doubt, it changed the direction of my ministry. I don't
Mhm.
believe I would be ministering how I am today or where my wife and I are ministering today if we had not learned that lesson in our personal lives. So that has radically changed who we are as a couple.
Well, that's great. We've enjoyed so many of the podcasts. It's so funny that the first one you chose was talking about, helping your kids become adults. I was one of the first ones we listened to, and I remember how impactful it was for us because at the same time we had just sent our kids really for the first time to go with our home church on like a 14-hour bus ride to camp. And when they got back, we realized, or maybe it was before they got to camp, we realized they had never like walked up to Chick-fil-A and ordered their own food. And we just thought, wow, we've been these helicopter parents, not trying to be, but we've just tried to protect them so much that even the simple thing of walking into a fast food place and ordering your own food. And so there's so many impactful messages that come across in thing these podcasts. So really encourage everyone to find the Better Together podcast, the 5 Minute Marriage. Put it on your if you have an iPhone, just put on automatic download. It comes once a week, usually one each if you can, and just put it on there. It's probably you can find it in other locations. Pastor, where can they find this podcast?
Oh, it's going to be on all the major podcast networks. Apple Podcast is probably where
Mm-hmm.
most people listen to
Yeah,
it, but
right.
Spotify, Google
Spotify.
Podcast, it's going to be on all those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I encourage you to put that on download, put it on as a subscribe, just have it coming in every week, have those messages. They're very timely. The word is evergreen. They never go out of style there. You want to sometimes even repeat certain episodes. And maybe as we conclude this primary episode, Pastor, what is some of the feedback you've gotten from your podcast, and how it's encouraging, maybe directing you towards future podcasts?
Sure. So the feedback has been phenomenal, and I love hearing how God uses the time that my wife and I spend together to encourage others. I'll say first and foremost, I have appreciated the feedback from people in our church. We initially started this podcast to minister to families in our community. And so it has been a blessing to hear how it has accomplished that. Now, beyond that, the podcast continues to grow. And so we have ratings and reviews that are left on Apple Podcasts as people are talking about what the Lord is doing through that. Almost every week we have new reviews that come in, which are just a blessing. And we always try to read some of those on air as well. It has also opened some other doors to be able to share what God has taught us. This last year, we were invited to speak at the Wilds, one of the Wilds couples retreats. And that's actually coming up in February. And
that's right.
Yep. It's the Sweetheart Getaway. And so my wife and I are going to have the opportunity to sort of present some of the things that God has done in our marriage through his word. That's been such a blessing. We're actually giving away, I'll for your listeners, if there are any that are in the States, we're giving away a spot to that conference. It's free. It's a $200, about a $200 value. And if you go to our Patreon page, which is free to join, there's no catch to this, Eric. Nobody has to pay for anything. Okay.
I understand.
Go to our Patreon page. There's a link there that you can simply put your name at the bottom. And then on November 22nd, we're going to draw one couple to have their conference paid for. We just want to be a blessing and have people come and just enjoy learning really what God has taught us through his word.
And Pastor, remind us again the time frame, when the actual time you're going to be in February at the Wilds?
Yeah, so that's February the 9th and 10th. We're going to be at the Wilds. It's for their Sweetheart Overnight Getaway. So it's a Friday, Saturday, and it's a perfect. I love that short retreat because you get there on a Friday, you're there all day through Saturday. For us, we drive home. We're back home for church on Sunday. It's a great retreat, and the Wilds does a fantastic job with that.
Well, we've been to the couples retreat and we've been around Pastor, so that's a great combination. If you're going to be in that area, make sure you look it up and you get a reservation. Well, Pastor, thank you for being with us. We're going to have another podcast in a minute, but we want to thank you for spending your time with us. Those of you who want to reach out, Pastor, and learn more about Chosen Vessel, where will they find that?
So I have a website, chosenvesselpottery.com. And if they want to sort of keep up with the mugs that I'm making, I normally post those on Instagram. It's at DJ Harry Pottery. So that's the best place to find that. If they're interested in the podcast, the website is growingbettertogether.com. And, but you can just Google Better Together with DJ and Lori and it'll pull up. And we have new episodes coming out every week. And then 5 Minute Marriage, we have 2 episodes that come out every Monday.
Well, Pastor, I love my mug, and the only detriment is that I've drank probably 50% more coffee now than I was drinking because these mugs, the mug I have is so large. Right. But I really enjoy it. Every morning I start the day with my trust in the Lord with all my heart mug. I encourage you, if you're interested, check out Chosen Vessel Pottery. Definitely check out Better Together, 5 Minute Marriage. Pastor Dennis Harry, thank you so much for being our guest today. May the Lord bless you.
Eric, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.